There we go. There we go. We're live. What's going on, friends, family? How you doing? Welcome. And we're already a few weeks into 2026, which is absolutely wild for me. And we are just about on the corner to 2027, which is crazy. Hey, what I want to do today for just a couple minutes, just jumping on and wanted to talk through just some conversations that we've been having. We've been doing a small vision cohort over the last couple weeks. We got like 4 more weeks remaining on this vision cohort. Super excited just about the conversations. Really, the goal of this is how do we steward this next year, right? How do we walk through this next year with intentionality, make sure we're clear in terms of what God is calling us to do. I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that most leaders don't lack passion, right? They're not uh, the leaders that we talk to, they are very motivated people. They're passionate, they're driven, they really want to reach college students, they really want to reach young adults. But I think that the challenge can often be is that there's a lack of clarity. Even when we jump on calls with people, we'll begin to do diagnosis around their vision or some of the things that they want to begin to move towards. And often what we'll see or hear in the conversation is they'll kind of wander back and forth. Well, we kind of want to have this or we kind of want to have that. So it's not a matter of the lack of passion, it's really lack of clarity. And this is where really vision begins to break down. So even as you begin to think about 2026, right, it rarely starts with you having a bad idea. It's really around this, man, just lack of clarity that we have in our leadership. And so one of the things I want to talk about here for just a couple minutes, and we saw this on the cohort that we had this week. Earlier this week, we were doing some reflection on last week's, and one of the things that we just kind of camped on week number one is that we really need to be honest around where we're currently at in the season we find ourselves in, right? What does it look like for us to tell the truth before we begin to make plans into the future? Because we can be super amped up, super excited, super, like clear in terms of what we're doing. But the reality is that if we're not honest around what is the current state of my ministry, my leadership, what is currently going on, often those things will begin to intrude on the vision that we want to have in our ministries. And so, really, the core problem is that when we think about the reality of our vision, when we're foggy around that reality, there's two things that tend to happen. Number one is that we can overbuild, right? So that we can think that if I just do more or push harder, like that's going to get me out of the fog. And so I just need to just like muster up the energy, the courage, the drive, get up earlier, stay up later. And so I'm just going to do more, which in our mind is we're pushing towards like overbuilding. So that can be kind of one response to when we think about when it's foggy. The other thing that can happen, and see myself this happen several times, is that we can shut down, right? When we're not clear around what God's called us to do, when there's the when we're things are foggy around what moving forward looks like, there can be this paralysis, burnout, or at minimum disengagement of what we're called to do. And so instead of like doing the work we're called to do, I'm actually going to shut down and scroll on Instagram, or shut down and kind of work twiddle on the website, right? And so we find other things to do that actually distract us, because what our brain is subtly doing, it's actually shutting down because it's not clear around where we're called to go. And so when things are foggy for us, when 2026 isn't clear, right? On one side that we can push harder and overbuild, but on the other side we can shut down, and paralysis and disengagement can happen. And I think what either of these responses, it's the same root problem. And that same root problem is that we are beginning to ignore the reality. We're actually beginning to ignore the constraints that we have on us. And so those constraints, they don't disappear because we ignore them. Right, just because we're ignoring something doesn't mean it's not going to subtly leak into our lives, that we can't just put blinders on. And so we need to acknowledge what those constraints are, because if we don't, it can be burnout, it can be drift, it can be relational breakdown, it can be stalled out momentum that we experience if we're not clear on that. So, what I want to do for just a couple minutes is talk about what are these constraints, right? What is it? What are the constraints that we can experience? And then how do we begin to analyze those constraints? And how do we begin to speak truth and be honest with where they're at? And so when we think about constraints, constraints are not, it's not because you're failing, right? So sometimes we can, as leaders, we can kind of self-absorb these constraints that we're experiencing in our ministry. But what we need to see that as not failure, but really as leadership data, right? We have data in terms of what are some of the things that I need to take into account as I think about moving forward. So when we think about constraints, it's not failure. What we do need to recognize is that when we have clarity, um, clarity, it's not just about control, it's really around stewardship, right? So we want to steward 2026 well as leaders and do all the things that God has called us to do. And so clarity is not really around control, but it's around stewarding our time, our energy, our resources, our finances. It's stewarding those things well and moving forward in faith, understanding those constraints, understanding the season we're in, but being faithful and stewarding that season well. And so when we lead with our constraints, it's better than pretending past them, right? When we lead forward with the constraints that we are in, the reality of what is going on in our ministry and our lives, it's better than just pretending past them. And so what we see all the time is that a smaller faithful plan beats a larger imaginary one every single time. So vision, this is not, when we talk about vision, that's one of the central conversations that we have with a lot of leaders. Vision isn't hype. It's actually alignment with what's actually possible. And what is possible is often informed by the reality of the season that we're in and the constraints that we are navigating in that season. And so I think sometimes, and this was apparent on the call here this week, as we were doing some reflection from the week before, is several people made the statement of like, it was so liberating just to name the constraints that I'm currently navigating or living in as a reality of what my leading needs to be shaped by, or needs to understand, or needs to navigate. And there's this liberation that can happen as we begin to name those constraints. So here's kind of three truths that we need to identify as leaders when we think about constraints, right? And this is a part of the framework that we gave them last week to talk in the cohort. The first one is to recognize, what is my capacity truth? What is my capacity truth? Like, what is actually possible in this season? I remember in quarter two of 2025, one of the cycles that our team does and the leaders that we work with is we do 90-day goals, right? And I remember coming out of quarter two super frustrated because what I didn't take into account in the goals that I was setting was the reality that for 3.5 weeks of quarter two, I was going to be in Africa. And so I had made goals as if that space, that the event wasn't going to happen. And so there was a capacity truth that I did not recognize of what was actually possible in that season. And when we think about capacity, that can be time, that can be energy, that can be your calendar, that can be emotional bandwidth. I was on a call with a leader yesterday in North Carolina, and we were just talking about that he started seminary at the beginning of this year, and so his emotional bandwidth, because of the reality of him being in seminary, he has to take that into account in terms of the capacity truth of what moving forward in this season looks like. And so what you can do versus what you wish you could do could be vastly different things. So just because you wish you could do something doesn't mean that you have the capacity to do those things. And so the first one constraint that we need to recognize is that there can be a capacity truth that we need to acknowledge. The second one is there can be constraint truths. And there are certain constraints on your ministry that is a limiter right now. It could be budget, could be the season of life you're in, it could be the lack of leaders you have. There are certain constraints that might cap your ability if you're not clear around some of the truths in those constraints that will cap your ability to move forward in 2026 because you don't acknowledge what those constraints are. And it's not that these constraints are bad things, right? It's not, we have several leaders right now that are heading into a season where they're expecting a child. And so that's just a recognition of saying, like, there's a constraint on the season, and I need to acknowledge what that constraint is. And so there's the capacity truth, there's a constraint truth, but the third one is there is momentum truth. And this is the question of, like, okay, what is actually working? Like, as I begin to look at our ministry, am I just blindly, like, ignoring the fact that there are certain things that are or are not working, areas that we have momentum and areas where we don't have momentum, and how do we begin to acknowledge what those areas are? We had to do this as a team this last week or 2 weeks ago when our team was together here in Austin. There was a recognition that there are a couple pieces in our ministry that just do not have the momentum right now. And so to blindly just move forward as if that is not true is going to be a limiter on what God is calling us to do in 2026. And so, how do we begin to recognize the momentum truth? So, there's capacity truth, there's constraint truth, there's momentum truth. And we need to acknowledge those things as a reality of the season that we're in. Now, a couple tools for you. I want to give you what we did a couple weeks ago was a constraint map. And what I want to do is I'm going to give you 4 quick questions, and these are questions that you can begin to ask that will help you begin to recognize what season that you are currently in. So, question number 1. And I would encourage you in these questions, take some time and journal, take some time and reflect, come back to them. Question number 1 is, what is your primary constraint right now? What's your primary constraint right now? And how do you begin to acknowledge and call out what that primary constraint is right now? And like what I said before, that is an extremely freeing thing that you can do in your leadership, is to acknowledge what that. So question number 1 is, what is your primary constraint right now? Question number 2 is this question of, what should I not pretend is fine any longer? What can you no longer pretend is just fine, but you need to see it as it really is? Now, this takes a level of boldness, a level of intentionality, humility to say, hey, there are things that I need to acknowledge that are in a certain way that I cannot pretend my way past them anymore. And here's the thing, that is not a reflection on your leadership. Like, the reality of what you can no longer pretend is not a reflection of you being a bad leader. So question number 2 is what can you no longer pretend? Here's question number 3. Question number 3 is what breaks by April if nothing changes? Or if you're watching the replay of this and maybe it's April already, just think 3 months or 4 months ahead of time, right? Next 90 days. What breaks if nothing changes? Like if you just continue to like, I'm just going to continue to move forward, power through, keep going, what breaks if nothing changes? And here's question number 4 is what is the one thing that you need to either stop or simplify? What is the one area in your life or the one area in your ministry right now that you need to stop or simplify? So number 1 is what is your primary constraint right now? Question number 2 is what can you no longer pretend is fine? Question number 3 is what breaks in the next 90 days if nothing changes? And question number 4 is what is the one thing that you need to stop or to simplify? And I want to encourage you, sometimes stopping before you start is the most important thing you can do, because vision momentum is often protected by subtraction, by pausing, by stopping certain things. And stopping is not quitting, it's actually choosing, right? So you're not quitting on something, you're choosing of where to allocate your energy, your focus, your time, your resources to. And often the simplification of our ministries in these spaces can create that space that we need for focus and clarity that will help us begin to move forward. So here's your action. We'll wind it down here this afternoon. Is what's your action? A couple things. Take some time and walk through and ask the question, what are the constraints that you have? Do the constraint map. Choose one of those primary constraints and ask yourself, like, what does it look like for me to acknowledge what is true in this season? Right. And take some time and journal. What is that primary constraint? What can you no longer pretend? What if you continue to move forward in the next 90 days? What is going to be true? And so here's the reminder for us here as we finish here today. You don't need to figure everything out, right? You don't have to figure out every single thing. The question is what is the next step that you need? And once the reality is clear, then we can begin to create clarity around moving forward. And this is what we've been talking with these leaders, that we had to acknowledge first with what was true. And then once we acknowledged what was true, that allowed us the space to begin to have clarity around what moving forward looked like. And just so thankful for these conversations that we've been having with leaders. Man, if you need something, man, we would encourage you, jump on a call, reach out to us. You can DM us at any point. We'd love to hear a little bit more about your ministry and what's going on. But we hope that I hope that this is helpful for you as you begin to get a clear vision for this next year. Okay. We're going to do this a little bit more in 2026. That's one of the things that we're committed to, is just kind of more broadly offering content and frameworks and things that we're working on with leaders behind the scenes, and to kind of put those out more publicly. So we love you all. So excited about what God is doing in many of your ministries. So thankful to be able to walk alongside so many amazing leaders. Okay. We'll talk to you later.